Okay. So what I'm going to be talking about today is really talking about this concept of impact. Let's see if I can make this die. All right, so I'm going to be talking about this concept of impact. Now, I've been around a long time, and this is even though it's always existed, it's a relatively new concept in grantsmanship, explained this way. So impact is really exactly what the subtitle says, and that is, why should your reviewers care enough about your work to advocate for it, which is a really important thing in the study section. And then the secondary part is, why should the taxpayer fund it? I mean, pretty much there are way more people out there who are vying for biomedical research dollars than there is money. So that they really want to be funding the work that has the ability to really change paradigms in the field. Those paradigms could be how much could be patient related. They also could be fundamental changes in our understanding of basic principles of biology. And but in the end, that is really what the decision is being made on funding. Now, 20 years ago, we didn't talk about this impact, but it was considered part of good grantsmanship to convince people about why we should care about our work. The idea of impact, though, is now explicitly codified in NIH grants because in fact, the score you get about being funded is called the impact factor or impact score. But even in other granting agencies that may not use this term impact, it's fundamentally what you're trying to convince people of. And this is very much like I gave a talk at Christiana a few weeks ago on the idea of empathy in scientific communication. And it's being able to get out of your own head, because you already think it's the most important thing ever. Your career is wrapped up around this concept. But the issue really is that, are you going to be able to convince someone else? And it's really getting out of your own head, getting in the head of the person reading this and trying to figure out what floats their boat, what would make them excited. And there's different populations. Let's see. Erin, the slides aren't going. I'm trying to go to the next slide. Let's see. Where is this? No, it's on. The computer may have. Sorry about that, guys. Since it's running.
There we go. I think it
just
had a Cyber Monday moment.
Okay. So that I'm going to start with this saying is that what is impact? And impact as a concept was really first codified in federal grantsmanship. I guess this was 7 or 8 years ago now, with the beginning of the Reinventing Peer Review initiative. And NIH calls it the likelihood for a project to exert a sustained, powerful influence on the research fields involved. Now, this is a highly, highly subjective assertion. And the thing about this being so subjective is that it's because that people who are more familiar with a field of research are more able to quickly see whether or not a topic is going to move a field. If you're from a little bit outside of that field, you might find it interesting, but you won't really be able to say, is this really going to change the way we think about the field? Because the reviewer may not completely know how people think about the field. And while we all say that, the problem is that we're not getting enough expert reviewers, honestly, you don't want just expert reviewers reviewing grants, because that if people have a dogma in their head, they're not able to see how somebody else's ideas could be paradigm busting. And this is why NIH actually does not have 3 subject matter experts review grants. Usually it's one for sure subject matter expert, one person who's highly familiar, and then usually it's a well-informed expert in a related area. So when you're looking at this, you need to not just convince the subject matter expert, you also need to convince the person in a related area that this could be interesting or important. Okay. Now, from the standpoint of the score impact, how that is determined, it's first determined by a preliminary, very subjective assessment by the assigned reviewers. And that is a scale of 1 to 9, and 1 means high impact, and 9 means no impact and really no value at all. Now, these preliminary numerical impact scores, they're supported by what the reviewer writes as an overall impact statement, and that's written by the assigned reviewers. Then the final impact score is they take the top 50% of the preliminary scores, and then those grants are discussed in study section. Based on the discussion, the other members of the study section then vote. Now, the thing you have to keep in mind is that most of the people scoring your grant haven't even read it, okay? So this score is highly dependent on the initial assessment of the 3 reviewers who are writing reviews. Now, people do have the option of voting outside of a range that they might set up. So it could be that one person votes a 2 and 2 people vote a 3. The range is 2 to 3. Now, most of the study section members are going to vote either 2 or 3. However, study section member could vote a 9 for your grant. The only thing they're asked is that if they're voting outside of the range, they have to give a very short little justification to the guy running the study section, because they want to be able to convey why somebody really, really hated it or why somebody really, really loved it. Now, once you have that average, then you have the average of these scores is multiplied by 10, and that gives the reported impact scores of 10 to 90. Now, some things to keep in mind is that if you're not discussed, you're just going to have an ND on your program thing, which means that practically people almost never see impact scores that are higher than 50. They usually see between 10 and 50. There are some rare exceptions. There was a grant that I reviewed over the summer that was, in fact, that ended up with an 80. It did receive a score, but the reason for that had to do with the vagaries of the weird study section it was on. We discussed all grants in that study section, but there were only 4 grants that were actually being reviewed. So in most cases, the highest score you're ever going to see is a 50. Usually you'll see, and usually you seldom see higher than a 40, to be honest. If you see a whole number score, like a 10, a 20, or 30, it probably means that all the primary reviewers agreed. How they discussed your grant was convincing to everyone on the study section, and you get a whole number score you get a 10 score like that. However, let's say your score is a 17. It probably means that a couple people voted 1, a couple people voted 2, and then that meant that most of the study section voted 2. And then you had a couple 1s in there to bring down your total impact score to a 17. So just some things you can kind of figure out what might be going on just by looking at your numerical score when that's reported. So now the important bit, though, is that, that's the score. That's the number you get usually 2 or 3 days after the study section meeting. And you'll have a general idea, perhaps, whether your chances of getting funded or not are. You might have an idea because of this, how the averaging is done, whether people agreed or disagreed among themselves about your score. But what you really need to know here is how to influence what that number is going to be. And in the end, is that how do reviewers assess impact? Now, to be honest, it really comes down to the cool factor. If a reviewer reads your grant and thinks this is extremely cool and they really want to see it done, they're going to give it a high score. If the reviewer says, it's good science, but they're going to give it a score maybe in the 3 to 4 range. Or they can decide, this sucks. I don't care about this. The design's terrible. And then it probably won't be discussed. That's really how people make decisions. But the reviewer is actually asked to break down this gut reason they're giving an impact score down to justifying what that score is. And that is explaining it to the people who make the funding decisions. That is not explaining it to you as the applicant. And the thing that I try to say is that in the current NIH rules, your grant reviews are not written to you as the applicant. They are written to the program officer who makes funding decisions. But when the reviewer is justifying that gut reaction, that they're basically having to assess and determine, does the problem study have big picture importance? And this is not just saying that pancreatic cancer has a very, very high mortality. Everybody would agree that understanding pancreatic cancer is important because of its high mortality. But the question really is, does your experimental approach or your intervention move that needle? And when they say the problem having big picture importance, that is convincing that reviewer that this project could change that fundamental fact, in this case about pancreatic cancer. Now, is the unanswered question that the grant is investigating important to the larger field? Now, this could be that we all end up on projects where we get so wrapped up in the minutia of what we're studying that we lose track of the idea of, does anybody actually care about me? And that there's a lot of things that we can continue, and you often will see this with people who they start their first project after their postdoc, and they're working on it, and they get involved in more and more and more detail. But it gets to the point where nobody cares about what you were studying with your postdoc 20 years ago. And this is why it's important to try to develop new projects which might have importance to the larger field as it sits now. I have a really good friend of mine he studied the same thing from the time he was a graduate student. And by the time he was a 60-year-old professor, he had his methods really down, and he could get the precise mechanism of how this viral oncoprotein would work. But in the end, he got his last time he submitted a grant for it, they basically said, you've done spectacular work on this problem. You have answered this as much as we care about. And while you could get the new mechanisms in more molecular detail, nobody actually cares. And, and to be honest, he retired and he's living in the wine country now, and he's an extremely happy person. So you can't say that was a bad outcome in the end, but it often happens to people earlier in their field than that. So it's always important to think about not just working on what you're working on, but developing new projects so that you don't get into this issue where you're starting to investigate unanswered questions that no one cares about anymore. And thinking about, is what you're doing something someone's going to care about future-wise? Now, it's also, is the experimental design likely to answer the question? This is actually a really common problem with grants, is that people write their aims page or they write their impact statement saying, we're going to solve this problem. But they never, and then they write their experimental design actually talking about, and that's developing and they're working on that for a month or two. That ends up addressing a different problem than they put out in their specific aims page as answering. And this divergence because you write your aims page first usually, and then you develop the proposal. Well, that developing of the proposal is more ideas, but if you never go back and reassess your intro or your aims page, your experimental design can significantly diverge from the scientific question you're studying. And that kills a lot of grants. So be very, very careful about that. Once you have the entire thing drafted, make sure your experiment's really getting at the fundamental question you're asking. It could be you need to change the experiments, or it means that you need to restate the question you're asking. And then the last score, which we call the last criteria score, is does that investigator or institutional environment make it likely for the project to be successful? So do you have the infrastructure you need to do your work? If you're a clinician, do you have enough patients with your favorite disease to study this in a statistical way? Especially if you're a young investigator, do the reviewers think you have enough of a clue that even if this is a great idea, you can actually pull it off from a administrative point of view? So, and these are basically just the standard criteria scores you see in an NIH grant review. Now, this is something that I'm going to change gears a little bit, because everything I've talked about is impact as defined by the NIH. The official impact statement for a grant is not written by the investigator. It's written by the reviewers. It is the statement that justifies their final impact score that they're going to give you. The issue really, though, is that why am I talking about you needing to write one as the applicant? It is not specified by NIH as a portion of the application. There is no section devoted to an impact statement written by the applicant, okay? Well, the real reason here is that the best grants make it easy for the reviewers. That if you just rely on the reviewer to write the impact statement, that basically you're hoping that they're going to come up with the same ideas and why anybody would care about your work as you have. So you're leaving an awful lot to chance. Some of this is because they're reviewed by a mixture of subject matter and general experts. And it makes it, by explicitly pointing out that importance of your work, it makes it easier for that general expert to see why they care. In my field, I am a ocular biologist, and that people think eyes are eyes. But in the field, we're actually broken down into different parts of the eye, because the retina is really a neuroscience problem. The lens and the cornea is really an epithelial biology problem. And we actually use different methods. We think different ways. We think about a lot of things differently. But when grants in my field are reviewed, the first reviewer is usually an expert in lens, which is what I study. The second reviewer might be lens, but is definitely an epithelial biologist. That third reviewer is a neuroscientist studying the retina. So when I write a grant, have to make it clear to the person studying the retina why they should care about what I'm doing. I'm not just talking to those epithelial biologists. Now, if you go to any grant writing workshop run by anybody, it says that well-written grants with a clear focus receive higher scores since reviewers can understand them better. Now, a well-written grant is not able to help a sucky project. However, there are probably more grants that are great projects that are torpedoed because they're not written clearly, so the reviewer has the perception they're a sucky project. So you have to have a great project or you're not going to get it funded, but it has to also be very well explained. Now, as I said about the NIH scoring system, is that you assign 3 reviewers. They're going to give preliminary information. Now, they then have to go and explain why they voted what they voted to the study section. And particularly if they gave a grant a very good score, they have to justify very, very strongly to the other, 15 people in the room why this grant is so great. They have to articulate that clearly. Now, this can cause some vagaries because, to be honest, there's people who come to study section and are primary on a grant and come like this and are very low energy. And it makes it really hard for the other members of the study section to get excited about your grant if that's the person presenting your work. You also have people who are very mouthy and emphatic and like me, I tend to be if I love a grant, I'm very, very aggressive about it in study section. But in the end, though, that if I read a grant, I think it's great, I have to be able to clearly articulate orally to the other study section members, why is it so great? If you tell me why your grant's great, and I agree with your assessment, I'll use your language. and I'll explain your words to that study section saying why I think this work is so important. That makes it so much easier for me to advocate for your grant because you've already thought through the language that really tells me why I should care about that work. Okay. All right. Now, and this really comes down to you need to set the agenda, not the reviewers. Okay. That, and that is so that people have the ammunition they need to advocate for your grant if it's a good project. Now, one thing that I will want to address right off the bat is that this is really related to marketing. It is pointing out to others why what you're doing is really, really important. The thing is that as scientists, we did not go into business, we did not go into marketing, and we don't do sales. And people who are, and those in the scientific community often distrust people who are very comfortable with marketing and sales. And this means that scientists seem to believe that the importance of their work should be obvious to everybody. By having to explain why it's important either means the person that you're talking to is stupid, or that actually mostly the importance of is stupid, and that by trying to market it and push why it's important is kind of a dirty thing. It's shady. It's trying to pull something over on someone else, which does mean since your audience is an NIH grant review, you do have to be a little careful about not going over the top on this. But almost nobody goes too over the top when it comes to selling their work. The other thing has to do with, there we go. The other thing has to do with that you need to think about who should be more capable of making an accurate, crystal clear statement of your grant's impact. Keep in mind that you are the world expert in the subject of your grant, or at least you should be. So you spent months writing your grant. You might have spent years or decades studying your scientific problem. You should know why you're doing what you're doing. However, the reviewer, if you're lucky, they'll spend 3 hours with your grant. They're going to read it and they're going to write something after reading it. So you should be able to articulate why that reviewer should care way better than just a quick read from a reviewer. And one reason this is really important is I was actually a participant in this study, is that NIH did a study where they took NIH grants that had been funded over the previous 4 years, and they asked seasoned reviewers to review the grants again. These were funded grants, and rank order them in priority. And they were trying to see if there was a difference in quality of the grants going to different study sections. This is something that is generally believed in the scientific community, that some study sections are harder than others because they may have more Nobel laureates or just a lot higher percentage of really high quality grants. So NIH attempted to study this. And I was one of the reviewers of this. So I was given 12 grants that had been funded before, and I was asked to rank order them. And then I was also asked to talk about what was my familiarity with the science. And I will tell you that it is really difficult to evaluate grants where you're not in the field. And there was a grant that I read that was by a Nobel laureate using all kinds of innovative techniques. And I actually found the science of what they were studying something I cared zero about. And I found the whole thing an entire snooze. Now, I don't know what that original score was from that grant. I did not give it a particularly high score just because I found it really, really boring. But I would bet that who actually reviewed it for real gave it a very high score. And in fact, the NIH results show that reviewers are most likely to rank grants in their area of specialty higher than those outside it. So the only thing that correlates in when they did this entire study wasn't that they could not tell whether there was a difference in quality between grants going to different study sections. But what they could tell is that if you were a subject matter expert, you were more likely to rank a grant higher than a grant that you weren't a subject matter expert in. So it really comes down to is that you need to be able to engage those general experts and make them understand why they need to care about your work. Because the subject matter expert is probably more likely to see it very quickly. Okay. So since we don't want to let the reviewers set the agenda about why our work is important, or even worse, not be able to understand why our work is important, that we need to be able to explain this. And this means that you have a goal of explaining in 1 to 2 sentences, why is this grant is important? How will it forward the field? And why is it likely to be successful? Now, I have 3 examples of impact statements that were pulled from the abstracts of grants that are in NIH Reporter. And actually, this is a very nice website from sciencesherpa.com. And I would recommend you go and read through this. It's basically breaks these things down into their component parts. So that here, for instance, they're basically saying that their studies are going to have a large impact on human immunity to tuberculosis, as they will markedly expand our knowledge of targets of human T cells in tuberculosis. Now, then they say why I care about that. Well, it's going to allow for novel studies and discoveries and could provide a pathway to better TB vaccines. So it's basically saying that if we know this, why is that going to move our field forward in a way that it wouldn't have otherwise? That in this particular case, I don't no idea what ACCEL is, but they're saying that whatever ACCEL is, they're studying what happens after that, and then they're trying to develop interventions that will reduce the occurrence of something bad, even though I don't know what it is, and so they're basically trying to help the complications of the person who survives whatever that is. So they're basically, again, telling the reader why they should care. Now, the other thing about reason why this is important is that very often there's grant score compression. So you have a lot of grants that are actually scoring very close to each other. And this means that the program officer at the institute has a lot of leeway in deciding which grants get funded or not within a middle range of scores. And so if you can really excite a reviewer, that you also can really excite a program officer. So you have 4 grants with the same score, only 1 can get funded. If the program officer says, I really need something developing better TB vaccines because that's part of my portfolio and I don't have any grants doing that, pointing out why that could be an important thing could really make that program officer pick your grant to be funded and not the other 3. And then on top of it, it also comes down to getting money from Congress. And so what you end up having is you have congressional oversight. Congress decides federal grant budgets. And we all know stories of congressional staffers picking grants out of grants databases saying about how they were the golden fleece and why would we study something happening in a fruit fly or whatever. And some of the reason every single grant that's been pulled out like that, it could be explained later why we care about learning in a fruit fly or whether a fruit fly can learn to fly mazes. But if the grant abstract doesn't say this directly applies to understanding, let's say, human learning or the neurobiology of human learning, you can't expect the congressional staffer to have noticed that. And that means your grant might get flagged and you might be splashed in the press. Or if all they said was, we care about this because that this is a model of human learning and we will get this new insights of some important thing, they would have never been called into congressional committees. So that's even a bigger picture reason to explain why your work is important. Okay, so when it comes to crafting an impact statement, you do want to be specific. A general statement is not helpful. And when I say about general statements, I'll go back to the pancreatic cancer example, is that to say that understanding pancreatic cancer will help us develop new treatments and cures of pancreatic cancer. Well, yeah, but why would your investigation be able to move these things? So you really want to say why what you're doing is going to move whatever you're talking about. You want to have a clear-eyed, objective focus on why your work will advance the field as well as contribute to the mission of the funding agency. This contribute to the mission of the funding agency is actually quite important. Every funding agency has a mission to address a certain profile of things in the strategic plan. And it's not a bad idea if you know which institute your grant might get funded by, to actually take a look at the strategic plan, say what are their funding priorities. Because one reason that if there's 4 or 5 grants at the same score, one reason one might get funded and not another, or even one who scores a lot worse can get funded and not the other, is simply because they have no grants in a certain area, but it's part of their mission. So they'll fund it because it fits this mission critical thing that they don't have anything in their portfolio for. So by knowing what the mission of your funding agency is and pointing out how your work addresses the mission, that helps the program officer who makes the funding decisions. Now, it's really good to talk this over with others. We all get too in our own little world, and we get too interested in things that are sometimes trivial. And by talking to, you go to a conference and you talk to people who are well known in the field, even calling up and talking to the program officer who would make funding decisions about your grant and tell them, I'm studying this for this reason. Is this something that your institute really cares about? They're either going to encourage you or discourage you. There was somebody in my department where this just happened with, is that he had a really great idea, but there were 2 directions he could go with it. One was really a methods development direction. The other way was studying a particular treatment goal. And he ran both of them through the study section or the program officer. And the program officer said that while the methods development section is important, it's not going to do well in the study section in their experience. So he's going to write the grant based on the mechanistic part. So talking to the program officer and figuring out what is going to be important to who is really important. That if you were in the business community, or you wanted to start your own business, or you were interested in trying to get venture capital, they would tell you to put together an elevator talk. So the idea is that if you get into the elevator with the CEO on the 1st floor, by the 10th floor, you should have engaged that person and explained why what you're doing is important, and in that case, why they should hire you or why should they give you venture capital. In this case, you should have a equally concise description of why somebody would care about what you do. And it's a good thing to have anyway. You never know when you're going to come across a donor, especially those of you who are in the clinical environments, that wealthy patients who are grateful are willing to give money for medical research. If somebody says, oh, you do research, tell me what you're doing. If that could be a wealthy donor. And if you can explain very, very quickly about what you're doing and what its impact is going to be on a patient, they might open up their checkbook. That has happened to people. So it's good for many, many reasons to have an elevator talk about why we care. Now, in that impact statement, you have to talk about that impact. You want to talk about the novelty about what you're doing. Is this something that is completely new? Is it innovative? Is it a way of looking at the problem no one else is looking at? Now, you want to make that obvious that this is very important, very novel, very innovative. However, it must be legitimate. While you can talk to a patient advocate, or you can talk to somebody who doesn't really know science very well, they're going to swallow everything. I am on an advisory board for a very rare genetic condition. And she calls me up, the director, who's a patient, calls me up all the time with these articles that you see that are just complete and utter crap. But she reads the marketing and says, oh, that might solve or cure me. And it's like, calm down. Nope, it's not going to cure you. This was actually a little news report that has great marketing about bad science, right? So while the BS could work in your elevator talk, talking to someone who can just open up their checkbook, it's not going to make it through experts in the field. It's not going to make it through a study section, and it probably won't make it all the way to funding. So you want to really not oversell. You want to have real validatable things related to impact and novelty. Now, one thing to keep in mind, if you cannot solidly explain why your work is critical to the field or will have a direct health impact, maybe you need to reassess why you're working on that problem. If you can't make those connections, it might just be because you're not thinking big enough picture, or it could be there really won't be a direct health impact, or your work really will not be critical to the field, which means you need to find something else to work on. It doesn't mean that you might not end up doing the experiments you've proposed, but if they're just filling in the details and not moving things forward, it's not probably going to make it through study section either. And this is, again, part about being brutally honest with yourself and really talking to people and seeing if they're convinced about your arguments or not. Okay. And this really comes down to, if you can't come up with a concise, accurate impact statement, it is not reasonable to expect the reviewers to give your application a high impact score. So that's saying you who work on it all the time can't come up with something someone will care about. How can you expect the study section member to advocate for you? Sometimes it just means talking to somebody else about your work and whether it's important to the big picture. I've seen this happen on a number of cases where somebody who's just somewhat older, who's been around much, who has a broader overview of the field, might be your best advocate, might really see your work as important, but they see it's important because they have a broader perspective than you do. And that person, if you have a conversation with them, could help tell you why other people should be caring about your work. But like I said earlier, good grant writing cannot help a bad project. If you can't develop a strong statement of the likely impact on the field, it might be necessary to shift fields or to modify what you're doing. And this really comes down to, and this is the fundamental principle of the Reinventing Peer Review Initiative at the NIH, is just because an experiment can be done, is scientifically valid, does not mean that it should be done when there is limited scientific resources, okay? So this is part of, the reviewers are supposed to figure out if the science is bad. But to be honest, in my experience, 80% of the grants coming into a study section, the science is fine. It's that some of the science, though, is more innovative, important, and likely to be impactful than others. So you don't just need to get into the good science camp. You also need to get into the moving the field camp. Okay. All right. So you're crafting your impact statement, but where do you put it? And this is a little tricky sometimes because there is no section denoted in the grant application for an impact statement. NIH does state, though, you should describe the impact clearly in words relevant to the project. So this means that you want to place your impact statement strategically in the places where it's most likely to be noticed. And this actually came from that Grant Sherpa article. They were recommending in the abstract. Now, I personally usually blow off the abstract of NIH grants. I just write something and put it in. And that's because that reviewers never read the grant abstracts. And it's even possible that the program officers never read the abstracts. However, it is good to have that impact in the abstract because it is read by the funding agency. It is usually the only information that the congressional oversight folks get. So while while the people who are making the direct funding decisions may not consider the abstract at all, it is important for the 40,000-foot view of grants. And so you want to have at least some information about that in that abstract. A place where it is absolutely critical to put it is at the end of the aims page, and probably the last couple sentences of that aims page. This is the part of the application read by most of the voting study section members. So even though that nobody on the study section is required to read your grant at all, except for the actual people who are assigned to it, when your grant's being discussed, people will usually glance at the aims page and they'll glance at your biosketch, in my experience. And so since this is going to be read by all of the voting, or by most of the voting study section members, it's also the part that's usually read by the program officer who makes the final funding decisions. And it's usually also the aims page is what's read by the study section director who assigns the reviewers. So that's how they decide what the topic of your grant is by reading your aims page. So by having that being the last thing read on the aims page, that's probably the part of your grant that's read by the largest number of folks who have part of the decision-making process. You also want to have it at the very end of the research plan. One mistake that people often make is that you go through your research plan and you write your last aim, you write your last sub-aim, you write the pitfalls and alternate approaches section, and they end their grant. So the last thing that the reviewer is going to read is why your experiments won't work. It's just a bad mindset to put people in, especially if they're tired and they're trying to do their grant reviews in a hurry, which happens. So have the last sentence or the last couple sentences be a re-emphasis saying, if this project is completed, we're going to find out all these great things and it's going to make an impact on the field, however. Now, it doesn't hurt to also point out, as you go through the experimental design, why each experiment in each aim or sub-aim is important. Why are you collecting this data set of patients? Why are you doing this intervention in the sense of trying to get people to change which databases they read? Why are you doing this Western blot? So you can even put sub-impact statements at the end of every single experiment to remind the reviewer why you did what you did and how knowing that piece of information is really going to move this entire project forward. Okay. All right, so the other thing is you have to make sure that your impact statement is supported. And this means that the entire application has to be well written and strong. Now, that basically the impact score, the number that is going to decide where you fall in the funding list, is something that the reviewer assigns. And I have here, it's a secret sauce made of the reviewer's opinion as given in the criteria scores of significance, innovation, research, design, investigator, and environment. It's not an average of these scores, but all the criteria are considered as the reviewer gives their opinion. I will tell you, because of human nature, usually the impact score is come up with, and then the reviewer goes back and justifies it. So this is why sometimes you can't necessarily, I think one of the grant writing workshops I gave on, they're just not that into you. That is where you can often get very picky reviews because they just thought the grant was blah and they have to justify it. So they'll over-pickify things when it's really is, the problem is this is blah. So however, that NIH has done a study showing that if you look at the criteria scores and you look at the impact score, typically the highest correlation is between research design and impact score. And to be honest, that's largely because 95% of grants are coming from excellent research environments. 85 to 90% of grants are coming in from people who have the credentials to be principal investigators. that from the standpoint of innovation is often not a major score driver because you can do lots of important things that aren't innovative. And significance is one of these things, is that does anybody care about this field? Usually those scores are pretty high. So research design becomes a major score driver. Now, in the end, though, is that you write the impact statement, which is supposed to excite your reviewer. That if you just put it out there as this marketing document that's not fully supported, the reviewer is going to be annoyed that you've basically oversold what your grant's going to do. The reviewer doesn't buy you're going to accomplish what you're saying the impact's going to be. And in some ways, you might even get a lower score because the reviewer's like, I don't like to be marketed to. I don't buy what you've said. So you do have to make sure that you don't oversell your impact statement. Thus, it's critical that you will actually accomplish what you say you are in that impact statement. It must be well supported on both the aims page and the research plan. Also here, though, you don't hesitate to emphasize anything particularly innovative or important. So are you doing an experiment that's never been done in your field before? Are you doing something in a way that will allow you to overcome limitations that your field has had for a long time? Don't be afraid to emphasize that. Now, this is often, innovation is a moving target. 20 years ago, confocal microscopy was innovative. Then microarrays were innovative. Then RNA sequencing was innovative. MicroRNA work was innovative. Now it's just part of what we all do. So also just make sure that, like, let's say you submitted a grant 5 years ago, it was funded, and then you're doing more on that project. It's probably no longer innovative, even though it still might be important. So with that, I want to just give you a take-home message. And this is that even though it's not strictly required by the NIH, you really want to write a concise and accurate impact statement. And it helps you focus your proposal on things that the reviewer and funding agency is likely to care about, so that you're not just studying stuff that no one actually cares. It also helps direct that reviewer towards understanding why they should care, because just by giving a list of experiments, it might not be obvious to the reviewer why they should care about the outcome of those experiments. The impact statement can be one of your tools to give the reviewer an idea of why they should care. Your other tool is, of course, to explain what the expected outcome is and what that expected outcome is going to tell us in a big picture way after you explain every experiment or every clinical intervention or however you want to call it. And this also, if the reviewer buys your argument and is excited about your work, it gives them the language that are these pithy marketing language that they can advocate for your proposal at the study section meeting. And this is important for the other two reviewers on the grant. So for instance, like I said, in my field, usually the first reviewer is a subject matter expert, the other two are not. And so it's important for the subject matter expert to say why this work is so critically important to that field. And even better, if they can also relate why it's not just critically important to this field, to let's say my field, why is it critically important to any other field? To show it's a broader impact than just, in my case, studying the lens. Maybe it'll tell us something new about epithelial biology. Maybe it'll tell us something new about cancer or blindness or all sorts of things. And this is important so for the remainder of the study section who have not read your proposal. And in my field, there's a lot of, since there's one funding agency and then there's all these sub-tissues, they're always angling for resources. That resources could be what percentage of the National Science Institute budget gets allocated to each area. It could be what percentage of talks at the national meeting get allocated to each group. There's a lot of, so you often are going in there talking to skeptics as that third reviewer. So you need to have the people on your side to help convince them that their assessment's right about your work. All right, so these are just some websites I came across, which I thought were particularly interesting. The Science Sherpa site, score higher by making the RO and overall impact crystal clear. That this was some examples of how to work impact into your specific aims page. This was an article published by Nature that is really talking about this whole idea of selling people on the importance of your work. And this was actually, I just thought it was a particularly nice writing guide about how to develop a research plan. I forget which one of these it was, but one of them actually breaks things down paragraph by paragraph, showing what each piece of the paragraph is doing to educate the reviewer about the importance of the work, which I thought was a particularly nice guide, so that you aren't just writing, but you're actually thinking, this is how I'm structuring what I'm trying to say. Okay. So with that, I think that's it for today, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. I'm not sure who's on or whatnot. So any questions for anybody on? Like we have 7 people on, but so if you have questions, great. If you just want to ask me a question offline, I think Erin usually provides my email address. I'm at the University of Delaware, so it's duncanm@udel.edu. And that I will see people back, I think, in a couple weeks. I forget what the next topic is. But, okay, so I think you can, since nobody's talking, Erin, I think you can shut me off.